Hi, everyone. It's Don Davis here, your host of Supply Chain Secrets. So today's episode was a lot of fun for me. We had two returning guests. First time we had a returning guest, won't be the last time, I'm sure. But we had Gordon Downs, who is the CEO and co-founder of NYSHEX, and Jesper Praestensgaard, who is our chairman of our board at NYSHEX. And today we talked about what is digital infrastructure in the shipping industry? And we start off by just really defining that and really looking at a definition from McKinsey on what they mean when they talk about digital infrastructure in capital markets. And is that something we can apply to the shipping industry? And then we talk a little bit about the history of the digital infrastructure and where it stands today and why it stands where we think it is today. And then we start to dig into well, now what? What should the industry do given the position that the digital infrastructure is today? What kinds of things need to happen in order to get to a place where we think we should be? And then we start to get into the future state. Like, what is it going to look like in the future? What kind of things are we seeing today? And what do we think are going to affect us as we go forward? So it was pretty interesting to dig into that. And then finally, we talked a bit about NYSHEX and what are we doing and how do we fit into this whole idea of digital infrastructure? How is what our journey been fit into this conversation? And I think it was pretty interesting to hear that. So I think it's a really interesting episode. I think it's great to talk about digital infrastructure because I think it's a space in our industry where we need development. So we certainly give you some thoughts. And we had two great leaders in the industry to talk through it today. So I think you really like the show. Give it a listen. And don't forget, give us feedback because we want to keep improving the content we put out there for you. So enjoy the show, everybody.
You are now listening to the Supply Chain Secrets Podcast with Brian Most and Don Davis.
Hi, everyone. This is Don Davis. I'm your host of Supply Chain Secrets. I'm a former executive of Hapag-Lloyd and CMA CGM, and I'm currently the Senior Vice President of Carrier Strategy here at NYSHEX. And today we have an exciting podcast because we have our first two returning guests after 40 episodes, Mr. Gordon Downs and Mr. Jesper Praestensgaard. So, Gordon, why don't you start off just introducing yourself for those that might be behind on episodes and haven't heard your first podcast. Why don't you remind everybody who you are and what you do?
Yeah, thanks, Don. Great to be back. So as my background, I started my career at Maersk, spent 12 years there, spent also a number of years with SAB Miller on the shipper side of things. And then, of course, today I'm the one of the co-founders and the CEO of NYSHEX. So it's great to be back, and I'm honored that I'm one of the first guests to be invited back.
Yeah, and it's a pity, Gordon, that I can't say you were the first actual return guest because it's a tie with you and Jesper. But Jesper, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Thanks, Don. My name is Jesper Praestensgaard. I've been many years in the industry, like the two gentlemen here likes to remind me, many years. I've been 25 years with Maersk, 3 years with Hapag-Lloyd, a few years with Boston Consulting, where I also did worked as an industry advisor within shipping and logistics. And for the past 5 years, I've been involved with NYSHEX as a non-executive director on the board, and latest here as chairman of the board.
Yeah, great. Thanks for that. So today we're all together to talk about the digital infrastructure in the shipping industry. And I think for a lot of listeners, they may not completely understand when we talk about digital infrastructure. What does that exactly mean? And in preparation for the show, we always try and research and look at different things to help prepare. And there wasn't really a good example for the shipping industry. But our friends at McKinsey were doing some work on talking about the capital markets infrastructure, and they came up with a definition. And so, Gordon, what I'd like to do is go through this definition, read it to our listeners to get some perspective of this is how it's viewed in the capital markets and how you think this relates to the shipping industry. So our friends at McKinsey define this as capital markets infrastructure, or CMIP, are the platforms as well as the pipes and plumbing of global finance, offering a range of services that support financial institutions, companies, governments, and investors in building businesses and contributing to growth in the wider economy. CMIPs range from international exchange groups with broadly diversified businesses to startup technology vendors that cater to specific points on the value chain. Between those poles sit an array of trading platforms, interdealer brokers, clearinghouses, security depositories, security services firms, information providers, data and analytics companies, index providers, and technology vendors, all of which contribute to the operation and growth of capital markets around the world. So that's how McKinsey defines it in the capital markets. But in the shipping industry, how do you think of that? Do you think that is the same, or what's top of mind to you when you hear that definition?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that's a good definition, and in some ways it applies quite well to what we have, at least the way we view the digital infrastructure in the industry. Now, of course, it's important to highlight that there's technology required in all elements of the industry, like how ship systems communicate with terminal operating systems, etc. And we're not referencing that. We're really focused on the infrastructure that is necessary to support the flow of information, the flow of finances, etc., between the carriers and the shippers and the NBOCC. So rather like broadly grouping anything related to commercial agreements, contracts, the fulfillment of those contracts, the settlement of payments, and everything related to that. So in essence, it's the plumbing and the interconnectedness and so on. And it's a fascinating topic because when you look at the global financial markets, it's a very mature ecosystem of, I like that definition, the pipes and the plumbing, where information can flow very smoothly, very efficiently between the various stakeholders in this in the ecosystem. In our industry, I think it's one where it's quite far behind, and I know that's why we have this as the agenda for our conversation today, Don. But definitely looking forward to digging in on this topic.
Yeah, and I think it's important as we talk about this to kind of reflect on the history, like where have we been over the past like 20 years? Because I think if you look back, in the late 90s, 2000s, things started to change in this industry. And Jesper, you pointed out that you're the veteran here. So it might be helpful to just give some perspective on what's the history of the digital infrastructure and how would you categorize it today relative to other industries, whether it's mature, underdeveloped, or how do you think of it?
Yeah, and I think you would start with the individual infrastructure that players in this industry developed. And with technology, each and every player in the industry developed their own stuff. The first probably big event that happened in the industry was around 20 years ago with the Intra platform. That was a brainchild of carriers in the industry, and the whole idea was to create a common booking platform. And we looked a lot at what had happened in the airline industry, and it seemed such a, I would almost call it a no-brainer, that why don't we establish this as a common infrastructure amongst carriers and shippers, so that if you're a shipper, you didn't have to worry about different interfaces. You can book everything through Intra. So that was sort of the first real common infrastructure project that I would say that we had in liner shipping.
Okay. And how do you think things have evolved since then? I mean, if Intra was the first, and I remember those days, there were actually three. I worked at Hapag-Lloyd at the time. There was Intra, which the carriers at one time owned and later sold. Then there was GT Nexus, which categorizes Asian carriers. And then there was sort of this outlier, which was Cargo Smart, which I think was a double O product. And they all kind of stood independently. And, we were trying to push shippers towards Intra. And what happened is that actually all three were adopted and connected to each other. But in the beginning, we were driving towards Intra. But how would you say that movement has evolved over time, and where do we stand today relative to other industries in terms of the development of the digital infrastructure?
Yeah, and I have my view on this, yeah, and I'm sure that there are others out there who have different views, but the way I see it is that we had those three platforms that you mentioned, Don, but we also had a drive towards individual differentiation. So that meant that it became an issue of say, yeah, I want to go for common standards as long as it's my standards. Or it became an issue of saying, yeah, I like the common standards, but let's keep that at a bare minimum because I like to differentiate on whatever else is above and beyond those standards. And I think that is the key issue. And my guess is that that's also how the financial industry, as an example, evolved. That it's an issue of saying, what is common infrastructure? What are the table stakes? And what are the elements that you would want to differentiate yourself on? And you can say that that has evolved over the years where, as individual carriers, and for that matter, big shippers develop their own infrastructure, it wasn't initially as probably an issue of creating differentiation based on that individual infrastructure that they developed, how tech savvy they were. Now to a situation where I believe that all industry players now are much more open to see what should form basis of the essential plumbing and what are the elements that we would want to differentiate ourselves on vis-a-vis the market.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. And I think today we're starting to see some change. There seems to be more openness and interest, and that things are starting to change a lot more rapidly. But, Gordon, what's your perspective on the history? And there's some component of this to say, okay, we can take this historical view, but now what? Like, what does the environment look like from today's perspective?
It's a fascinating trip down memory lane for me because I remember being at Maersk. I was there from effectively 2000 to 2012. And there were some years when all we were focused on was just reducing costs. Bigger ships, lower unit costs, being able to be the most cost competitive carrier in the market. And at that time, investing in technology, building out the digital infrastructure, etc., these were not priorities. I mean, I know that we had done it to some extent, but the priority was everything we could possibly do to pull down cost. And of course, those were hard days to work in the industry, and it wasn't very exciting. I remember how excited I was when I was earlier in my career and we first rolled out the Intra, and suddenly it was possible to do bookings online. And in my first job at Maersk, I was a booking coordinator, and I used to have to take bookings over the phone. And suddenly I could tell our customers, hey, instead of calling me, you can just go onto the website and you can do it yourself. It was so exciting. It was kind of sad when the industry went through these sort of hard years of intense competition and price wars, etc. That all that momentum and excitement we had around the ability to leverage technology kind of fell by the wayside. But of course, as all cycles come and go, that cycle's thankfully, I think, behind the industry. And now I think COVID, of course, has created this almost an imperative that companies start to focus on being digital and being able to service their customers entirely digitally. I remember in the old days at Maersk, a lot of people would pay for the ocean freight with a physical check, and they would come to our counter, like a bank counter, and have to hand over the check and get the cargo release and then go off to the port and go pick up the box. And of course, during COVID, a lot of places you couldn't go and pick up cargo. So you will pick up your cargo release. It had to be done digitally. So this sort of forced the industry to move forward with a lot more digital innovation, coupled with the fact that I think this industry has now sort of come through those years of the sort of fog of price wars, etc. And there's more sort of capital that the industry can invest. So it's quite exciting because I think that the industry itself is now facing an imperative where it has to become more digital. It has to build out this infrastructure, and B, suddenly there's the capital available to be able to make those investments in order to build it as it's needed. So I think it's a interesting sort of time in our like the evolution of the industry, but there's a lot of catch up that needs to be made here. I mean, I'd love to hear Jesper's point of view on that and how you see it.
No, but I'm with you on that, and I also remember the early days of Intra, where the issue then became, yes, we like the idea of this common booking platform, but every time there was an issue of taking that platform up a notch in terms of capability, sophistication, and whatever, there was this pushback saying, no, we're going to do this on our own website because that way we can do something in addition to what. So there was this sort of competition what you had, and I think in addition to what you're saying about the availability of capital to make the necessary investments, I think there's also an emerging appreciation for what is actually common infrastructure vis-a-vis what differentiates. And I think that's the industry is still struggling with it, and that goes for both the carriers and the shippers, because both the big shippers, the big carriers, they've developed proprietary infrastructure that they have sunk a lot of money into, and it gives them to a certain extent a competitive advantage. Now comes the issue of pipes and plumbing. What do you need to have in place as a common infrastructure. And once you do that, what now becomes available to those that do not necessarily have the same tech savvy or the same capital? And is that giving away the shop, or is that providing that commonality that you then build upon? And I think there is appreciation now for the fact that there is this commonality that we all need and that we would all benefit from. And there are a lot of solutions out there that are coming up. So I think that's really exciting.
Yeah, Jesper, as you were talking about Intra and how there's a drive towards the individual carrier's website, and I can remember that. And I think from a commercial perspective, it was always really confusing because, as Gordon was saying, like when Intra started, we're popping open champagne bottles. We're really excited about this. This is great, and then it just felt like it was stuck in neutral, right? That it wasn't really evolving, and that you saw this push towards the website. And when it came to steering your customer, it was a little unclear for me, like in a commercial role. Again, this is, I don't know, 20 years ago, but it was confusing as to what to do and where am I supposed to steer a customer. And it felt like we weren't as excited about people using Intra as we were our own website. There was a little bit of a pivot there. And I think that there's a consequence to that in terms of development, because I think that's part of the reason why we're behind, because of that type of behavior. But would you agree with that statement? That's what's slowing us down in terms of adoption of this type of standard?
Yes, definitely. And I should say that, yes, this is the case on the carrier side, but it's certainly also the case on the shipper side. So you would have a lot of shippers who've developed proprietary allocation systems and God knows what that they sunk a lot of money into, and that gives them certain benefits. And now you're coming and saying, well, is that actually part of common infrastructure, or is it something that differentiates you? So you have these hard discussions of how do you do that as an individual carrier or as an individual shipper.
Yeah. And so, Gordon, I mean, if you look at Intra and it didn't evolve the way it maybe I would have thought, and, eventually became linked with these other things. And so, taking that and looking at where things are, I mean, you mentioned that there's a lot more interest now. Why is the opportunity now? Like, why do you feel like today there's more of an opportunity than maybe there was 5 years ago?
Look, I think it goes back to what I said in terms of there is this imperative that things become more digital. For me, what is also very interesting is when, again, going back to the definition from capital markets infrastructure, the words that really resonated with sort of the pipes and plumbing. I mean, no one really differentiates on pipes and plumbing. You build a gazillion-dollar mansion and you put the best furnishings and everything in your mansion, but you don't need to have special pipes and plumbing. It makes no difference. The water still comes in and the wastewater goes out, and that's what it is. But this industry, I think, is going more and more integrated through APIs, and it's more focused on just getting timely information in a harmonized way when it's needed in order to drive better decision making, to improve efficiency, etc. And so I think it's starting to become clearer that there is just the basic flow of information is pipe and plumbing. The things that you do with that information, the way that you can create value-added services on top of it, the way that you might create a wonderful digital journey for a user who values something like that, those are all wonderful things to differentiate. I think in the early days, when you think back to Intra, it wasn't so much just about the data. A lot of it was also about the user experience and being able to create like a digital journey and everything else. But today, a big shipper that's shipping thousands of containers every single week, they don't want a user interface. They just want the data flowing in and out of their systems. And so I think that sort of shift in the industry, and of course it's been a gradual shift, but it's starting to draw a very clear line between what is pipe and plumbing and what are things that need to be differentiated. And I think that both the shippers, the carriers, and of course, don't forget the NVOCCs are starting to recognize that the pipe and plumbing just needs to work. So that's a big shift. There's another interesting thing, which for me is fascinating. When I just compare the way that the shipping industry functions in comparison to the capital markets industry. And of course, we spend a lot of time looking at different industries to try and learn from best practices and everything else. But just take global financial market. When they recognize the need for enhanced digital infrastructure, better plumbing and pipes, what will typically happen is the big players in that industry will get together and form a consortium. And that consortium will invest in a technology that will allow the industry to create this, what they call the infrastructure. I mean, I'll give you an example. the Intercontinental Exchange. Now, this was essentially started off in the early 2000s, roughly the same time as Intra was. And when it was started, of course, the intent was to use a technology to make the trading of energy contracts much more efficient, etc. And it was essentially like a consortium investment between the big oil buyers and the big oil sellers. And that was Shell, BP, Total, I think may have been others. And then on the buy side, it was Goldman Sachs, it was Credit Suisse, I think Morgan Stanley, and a few others as well. And they got together, formed this as a consortium investment. Everyone saw the value in having this as a common framework to be able to manage these contracts. And again, it was extremely successful. I think it created enormous efficiencies for everyone. It didn't change how Shell or BP or Goldman or Credit Suisse managed their buying and selling strategies, etc. That was all highly proprietary, but just the mechanism that allowed them to sort of effect these contracts and manage the settlement of these contracts was extremely efficient as a result of all of that. And of course, there are many other benefits. And that's just one example of so many. I mean, TradeWeb, Symphony, there are many, many other examples of this. This is a very, very common pattern. And I think that's something which in our industry we haven't seen very often. I mean, I think NYSHEX is a rather unique case where when we started out, we had, it's public knowledge, of course, Maersk, Hapag-Lloyd, CMA CGM, they invested along with General Electric and Goldman Sachs. And so there was somewhat of a consortium, but we don't see this all the time taking place in the industry. And I think that's one of the things that our industry still needs to figure out. Like there is value in potentially competitors coming together and converging on saying, okay, let's build this, but let's build it as a utility. And when we say a utility, build it where there's value. You build it once and you use many. And as a sort of investor in that consortium, you pay a small portion of the price of the investment. Like you don't pay the whole thing, yet you get the full value of it. And of course, you de-risk the investment because the fact that all the other players are investing in it too means that it's more likely to be successful. So there's enormous value. But again, it's got to be very clearly in the mindset that this is the utility versus this is something that's going to allow one player to differentiate a product or a service over another player.
Yeah, I
And
love that idea.
if I can
Go
add to
ahead.
that, Gordon, I remember I was meeting up with Goldman Sachs, and they actually explaining to us how they, together with all the other banks, had built that infrastructure and their whole thinking that there was indeed the part that just had to work fast, efficient, inexpensively for everybody. And then as soon as that data entered the Goldman Sachs organizations, that's where it became proprietary. That's where they did things to it where they meant or that they thought that this would differentiate them and make their traders smarter or whatever. And I think it's that definition of what is that versus what is infrastructure that is coming to us now in the liner shipping industry. I like to think it's coming fast because that appreciation there is coming. And now it's a matter of getting the job done. I mean, just like we do at NYSHEX, making sure that we now capitalize on that appreciation of what's necessary.
I was going to say, I love that example of like thinking about things as a utility, because when we talk about pipes and plumbing and utility, you start to kind of visualize that metaphor and how it could work in our industry, which is something that I think is needed because, for a long time, as we've talked about, I don't think the industry was always open to having someone else build it for you, use someone else's stuff. It was like, I'm going to dabble in this, but I'm still going to build my own. And I think it's slowed us down. So if we start to take that idea of this utility, pipes and plumbing, and we start to think about the future state of the industry, I mean, what in your mind, Gordon, are some of those things that need to happen in order for that to work that are not there today?
Yeah, there's a lot of dependencies, but just quickly touching on the future state. I think that if we just take some of the benefits that the global financial markets have gathered from this having a robust market infrastructure, i.e., all the necessary pipes and plumbing, and we extrapolate what that might look like in the context of the global shipping markets, it's extremely exciting. And what I mean by that is, if you just think about it in three big categories. Category number one, in terms of having more data in a way that you can use it on a more timely fashion, can drive all kinds of wonderful decisions that could reduce the waste in the utilization of a ship or the better optimization of an entire network, reduction of carbon, enormous value in being able to plan on the carrier side. By the same token, on the shipper side, being able to plan your supply chain, knowing with greater certainty whether your goods are going to arrive on time and if you have to make contingency plans, etc. So there's huge value just having that data to drive decision making and closer to real time. In terms of the efficiency, I mean, we all know how much work is done through email and through Excel in this industry. Our head of product at NYSHEX is always joking. Our biggest competitor is Excel and email. I mean, it's quite funny. But the reality is every time you can digitize, automate, and just have data flowing in and out of a system and having logic built into that system so that it can automatically triage and apply sort of events to determine, what the next course of action should be, it's avoiding enormous amount of workload, but not only workload, frustration, because we all know how frustrating it can be when you have to sort of just perform these rather meaningless tasks. A lot of times it's just waiting for someone else to take action, which is, again, usually dependent on some form of meaningless task, but still requires a human to do something. There's enormous value in terms of reducing efficiencies, reducing frustrations. And then, of course, the final piece is as you start to think about the interplay between finance and the way our industry works, there's a huge intersection between like the physical freight flows and the financial freight flows. And when you think about, today, just from a carrier's perspective, today as a carrier, if you've got an invoice for freight that's been loaded on a vessel already, you can finance that if it's outstanding. But you can't finance a contract that you might have sold, a year in advance. You can't use that to finance the purchase of a new ship or the charter of a new ship because, of course, these contracts are so unreliable. But as this industry becomes more robust and as you can start to see that these contracts are going to be materialized, etc., it becomes possible to use them as a financing instrument, etc. So there's so much value that comes out of this as the industry matures, as you end up with this data producing better insights, it flows more efficiently, it's more robust, etc. The benefits are enormous. Now, of course, like what drives this? I mean, we talked about the need for this, like almost a consortium type of approach. Like it requires multiple players in the industry, typically the bigger players, to sort of lean in and take a position and say, okay, we're going to use a common utility for these things. Of course, the strategic things wouldn't be the case, but the non-strategic things, we're going to use this as the common utility. And that creates this, what you call the center of gravity. And then others start to say, well, if these big players are using it, then perhaps there's value in us too. And of course, there's these typical, network effects in the sense that the more participants that use the utility, the more valuable it becomes for the collective. And so I do think that we'll start to see convergence on the elements of the market infrastructure or the elements of the pipes and plumbing that have this sort of adoption. They will start to see like almost like a network effect, exponential growth or exponential adoption curve. And of course, this is incredibly value accretive to the whole sort of ecosystem of carriers and shippers and NVOCCs. So I think it's exciting. And I think we're going to see a lot of quite rapid adoption, especially, like I said, as this sort of digital imperative becomes more and more critical. And as carriers and shippers becoming more sophisticated in how they think about data, and as they're more willing to invest in technology as a mechanism to drive efficiency and better use of data to drive decision making, etc. So I hope that makes sense, Don.
It does, and I think it's exciting because a lot of things that you mentioned there, I think our industry is starving for this type of efficiency and seeing that kind of value and using technology in a way where there's going to be benefit. And I mean, my sense is that there is quite a bit of frustration out there in the industry with the type of information and technology that's available to companies. And there's a lot of struggle out there, whether it's, knowing how to plan, like from a carrier side, planning their network. Where are my empty containers? I love one of the things that Rolf Haben Jensen said, that I have to book 400,000 TEUs a week to carry 240,000 TEUs a week. Like, so there's all this inefficiency in the industry. And how do you plan, where your containers are going to go? How do you plan when your ships are going to be full? I mean, as a carrier, you want to maximize these assets. So there's all these things. And when you start to talk about this whole idea of a digital infrastructure helping in that process, it's really exciting. But Jesper, I mean, to you, I mean, when we talk about the future state, I mean, what's top of mind for you that's required in order to make this happen? Because I think Gordon laid a foundation for like really exciting opportunities and really exciting value. But from your point of view, is there anything that you think needs to happen, either whether it's on a carrier side or shipper side, or how do you see this evolving in a future state?
It is evolving. And what's really exciting is that you have a lot of people out there working on solutions. You have log tech being defined now as an investment area. You have venture funds that are pouring money into this here. So a lot of things is happening. But coming back to the issue of having to book 400,000 TU in order to load 240, if you need to get to a point where people really understand what is basic pipes and plumbing and what's differentiation. And I think a perfect example is actually the whole contracting in liner shipping. We can all sit around a table and agree that there should be reliability, predictability, accountability, and all these things because that serves everyone well, right? I mean, you get more efficient supply chains, you have less buffers, you can plan your vessels better, you bring down your unit cost, you bring down your carbon footprint. All this is good. Now comes the issue of how. We have in the past seen a lot of players developing individual solutions. There was actually a famous quote from shipping executives that I like to sort of bring forward. And that quote was that we can develop better IT faster than you can, but that's not the issue. And I thought that was such a phenomenal quote. I wish it was mine, but it's not. But I think it's a phenomenal quote because it's a fact that if you are a big carrier or big shipper, you have the resources to build this. But that's not enough. You need to have the pipes and the plumbing, the basic foundation for how you now build on top of it. I don't think that neither shippers nor carriers should ever give up their prerogative to negotiate deals, to do their yield optimization, to do their efficiency planning, all that. But imagine a situation where they could do all that based on a common infrastructure that provided them insight, reliability, predictability. Oh my God. I think that is coming. I think it will come. I think NYSHEX is I like to think a perfect example of that. That we will get there and we will provide that benefit. And I think that there is this recognition that you need that platform, you need that neutrality that sort of cuts across the entire industry to get that done.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I think having somebody who's neutral is helpful. And maybe this is a good opportunity to talk about the role that NYSHEX is playing here and how do we fit into this conversation. And I'll turn this over to you, Gordon. Like when we talk about digital infrastructure, when we talk about these things about, the pipes and plumbing utility, how do you see the NYSHEX fitting into that role?
It's This for me has been something that I've appreciated, obviously with a front row seat, because when we first started NYSHEX, back we launched in 2017, our whole focus was on trying to drive this message that it's better to make a contract where there's a two-way commitment and we provide all this technology and we're on this journey of trying to help the industry to appreciate the value of this sort of contracting construct. What's happened, I think, partly due to all these supply chain bottlenecks, et cetera, is that I think the industry at large has started to recognize that there is value in committed contracts. Whether there's penalties or there's some other type of consequence for performance or not, somewhat regardless, but there is value in having contracts where the terms are clear and there's some method in which you can keep track of the fulfillment of those contracts. So I think to some extent, our primary job is done, that the industry started to recognize this. They both carriers, shippers, and NVOCCs see the value. And what we've also started to see is that a lot of carriers and also NVOCCs have started to innovate around the contract, these sort of two-way committed contracts, and create their own versions of these contracts. And that's exciting. And I think that's really important that each carrier is able, and every NVOC as well, being able to innovate in that realm. And this has almost forced us, in a good way, to take a different position on the industry and to start thinking, how can we use the technology that we've developed, i.e. the pipes and the plumbing, to support all types of different contracts. Now, of course, we're not talking about contracts where there's vastly ambiguous terms or there's no method in which these things can ever be, fulfilled or performed against. We're talking about contracts where there's some degree of integrity in the process. But all the technology we've built around how to structure these contracts, how to capture these contracts and convert them into machine-readable terms, how to harmonize all the data that comes from the carrier systems, from the schedules, from the shipper systems, etc., into one sort of system of record where both the carrier and shipper can recognize, yes, this is where I'm performing, or this is where I may be failing, or this is where my counterpart might be having a hard time. And then building workflows on top of that so you can automatically identify when exception happens, who's responsible, do they need to take action to get it back on track, or do they have to provide some extra information? Maybe a container didn't load because there was a hole in the roof and there's no data to show that, but there's a workflow for a user to be able to put in a picture of that container with the hole, etc. And then to the downstream settlement, like the financial flows around like holding of security if there's security chosen, the settlement of the invoice, etc. So all of these features or services that we've built up over the years, now what we're starting to do is allow that to become essentially the pipes and the plumbing. And on top of that, carriers and NVOCCs are starting to, and I suppose shippers in a way too, can build their own sort of customizable, configurable contracts, but just settle it through this network and get all the benefits of the, like we said, the efficiencies, the data, the ability to link in with the financial flows. So that's the journey that NYSHEX is on. And it's exciting. And I must say, I think it's, for me, a great sign of at least success on the mission that we're on, that the industry is starting to come around to this method, or at least the realization that contracting requires some degree of at least a common understanding of who's going to perform and how, and then some degree of sort of reconciliation as to who did perform and who didn't. And now it's just a question of, okay, how do we deliver this in the best possible way? And the sort of pipes and plumbing being a really critical piece of that puzzle.
Yeah, I do think it's incredible to see how there's been sort of this diagnosis that, hey, the root cause is the contract in some ways, right? Because these terms aren't clear and I'm not really sure what this means. It's always MQC divided by 52. Maybe in some cases somebody might say 50. And is that really the type? Does that really make sense for my book of business? And I think by having a company who is trying to create some ideas and clarity around this, and then there's a technology behind it, there's all these downstream effects of that. And Jesper, when you think about this, the ability for adoption, do you think that it's helpful now that there's been this consolidation in the industry, that we have fewer carriers, there's not as many major players out there? When you think about, this whole idea of the industry adopting this pipes and plumbing, creating this utility, is that an easier thing to do? Because we talked earlier, like when Intra first came out, I don't know, 20 years ago, the industry looked a lot different. There are a lot more carriers out there, and there might have been a lot of different kinds of thoughts. But now that we're in this type of environment, like, how does that adoption feel given we're in the state we are with the number of carriers out there?
I don't actually think that the consolidation that we've seen in the industry helps on this particular thing, because the danger is that you could say that those players have now become so big that they definitely want to do things on their own, right? They've got more muscle to do that as well. But I think that there is a recognition that this is necessary. And now, again, technology is there to help solve problems. And if you go back in time in liner shipping and you look at the problems we had 30 years ago, 40 years ago, it was also around reliability. It was also around, why is the space not there although I've booked? Why didn't that booking show up even though it was booked, and so on? And we were working on dead freight, no-show fees, service guarantees with money back to. There was all sorts of different solutions being worked on. None of them worked because there was not this commonality across the industry. And it has nothing to do with competition or collusion or things like that. It has to do with providing that platform that provides predictability and reliability that we all benefit from. I mean, if you think of it, the best proxy we have for reliability in the industry today is timeliness of schedules. Even though we all know that all the individual containers that moves, how many moved, how many were delayed, held up, and all that, that's what we got to address. We got to get to a point where we can build that infrastructure that means that shippers and carriers can actually trust what's going on. And again, I'm not saying that in the past people went to the office trying to do a bad job about things. I'm just saying that the way it was set up was an invitation to be less predictable. And now, with the infrastructure now being put in place, I do believe that there is an appreciation that if we do that, oh my God, I can now do my job a lot better, because once I get that predictability, I can do my planning better. I can do my optimization better. I can do all these wonderful things that at the end of the day will allow me to serve my business better, serve my customer better. Instead of worrying about, does my ocean contract, is that being delivered on time? Oh my God. I mean, that should be so basic.
Well, I love that point on trust because I think that's one thing that's so hard in this industry is trust, because you can point to either side that have, when the market seems to favor a shipper, they behave in a certain way. When the market behaves a carrier, they behave in a certain way. But one seems to be to the other's detriment. And if I'm really being authentic and I'm coming to you and I'm saying, Jesper, you need to trust me this time. I'm really going to do it. Do you really trust me? And he would say, well, past behavior has certainly indicated that it's difficult for me to do that. And maybe I'm foolish if I do that. But by having somebody in that conversation that can help build that trust, then you can start to do these other things much more faster than just, talking about it. Because again, there's a history there. Now we're near the end of the show. And what I'd like to do is just ask one more question. And if there's anything you want to add, please bolt onto this question. But I think we've talked about a lot of different things, and it's exciting because I think this industry needs to change. I think it is changing, and the fact that it's changing faster. But if I'm a listener, I'm wondering, like, how far away are we from some of these things changing? Like, when would I expect to see something that I feel like is an impactful change as an individual? So, Gordon, I'll pass that question to you first. I mean, what do you think the time frame is? Like, how quickly are things changing in the industry? And I know it's like I'm asking you to be Nostradamus and predict the future, very difficult to do. But just from your perspective, what do you think?
I think it's changing very rapidly, quite frankly. I think that we see it, our growth curve is definitely exponential. And that's, of course, just one data point. But it shows that the mindset is changing rapidly. I think we're seeing additional data points. For example, this new OSRA 22, which just passed last week. And again, I know it's super controversial, but it just indicates a change is coming very rapidly. But, that's not necessarily going to be the answer that people in the industry or like shippers and NVOCCs and carriers might be looking for. I will say this. I think that, the speed of change really depends on people willing to sort of lean in and say, let's change. And what I've seen, which is extremely encouraging, is that where a shipper or an NVO or a carrier has said, look, I want to try this. I want to use a better framework, a better contracting structure. I want to be able to drive innovation, etc. And they've gone out with the intent to sort of set this up. It's very easy to find a match where the counterparty on the other side of the sort of table, so to speak, is also willing to try this. And so it just requires, an impetus, someone to lean in. And even in the case of small shippers, we've seen it. A small shipper will lean in and say, I'm willing to commit. I want to use this type of framework. I'm willing to innovate. I don't want to do it the old way. I want to try the new way. And it's not that hard to find someone who says, okay, yes, let's try this. We both stand to benefit if we can achieve it. So hopefully that's encouraging.
I think that I'm glad to hear that from your perspective. It sounds like it's changing rapidly. And Jesper, for you, same question. I mean, do you agree with that sentiment that you feel like it's changing quickly and it'll be something that we see happening faster in the near term than we've seen in the past?
I'm actually convinced. And just like Gordon said, if you look at our numbers and the growth, that seems to support that very much. But also the discussions we're having right now with people, both carriers and shippers, there's a lot at stake. And what we got to remember is that people sometimes talk about being rational or irrational. I mean, oh my God, this is irrational what's happening in the industry. Well, what we have to bear in mind is that what we've built up so far has, from an economic context, been very rational in terms of rates going up and down, the predictability being low because you overbook both from the carrier side and from the shipper side and all that. So that's a very rational way of actually dealing with it. Now, a different rationality should drive the changes we have right now, because we can see that the uptake we have in NYSHEX is that people are buying into the concept because it does bring that transparency, reliability, predictability that everybody benefits from. So again, both my head and my heart tells me that this is about to happen. It is happening, actually.
Well, that's good news. That's exciting. And I think the good news for our listeners is that we have had Gordon and Jesper back again. So we will have them back a third time and we can validate this and we can ask them all kinds of questions about like why this didn't happen. And like you told me, that this is going to happen soon, and I'm not feeling it. So we'll have you back. Okay,
I
so
wasn't told about that, Don. So you're going to hold us to it now?
well, it's just the listening audience. They're very, very tough out there. So we're really at the end of the show. I just want to offer, is there any other comments or anything that you want to share out to close out the show today? Anything
You
off?
go, Jesper.
There's a ton of stuff you can talk about. I mean, the whole notion that we are supporting an industry which is so important to global trade, to the average consumer, that the fact that what we are putting in place has ramifications way beyond the industry, I think is awesome, and also humbling that we are actually in the midst of making changes that I think will be hopefully seen and noticed way beyond our little studio here and way beyond the audience to this podcast here.
Yeah, I think it's really fun to be part of the change in the industry and see it changing. And I know in the 2-ish years I've been a part of NYSHEX, I've seen a lot of change, and it's just been an incredible journey, and it's been really fun to be a part of it.
Yeah, I echo that.
So great. Well, thanks, Gordon, and thanks, Jesper, for coming on the show. I think it was a great show, and I think our listeners got a lot out of it. Certainly, they know what digital infrastructure is, and I hope that gave some insight. So to our listening audience, don't forget, rate us, review us, wherever you find our podcast, Apple, Spotify, or wherever you find our podcasts. So thanks for listening, everybody, and we'll talk again soon.
Thanks for listening to the Supply Chain Secrets Podcast. Make sure to subscribe to the podcast on your favorite podcast network.